All right, class, welcome. We're going to wrap up Module 5, an emerging world power. So where we left off was the United States getting involved in World War One. And this timeline might get a little convoluted here. The Russian Revolution happens during World War One, so these two things are happening simultaneously. On the image here, you can see the uh, the dynasty, the royal family that ruled Russia, the Romanov family. And this single family was in charge of Russia for over 300 years. All right, so this was a monumental revolution. The first step, the Tsar, Nicholas II, abdicated, basically resigned, gave up power, and a democratic government was installed. And so they had elections for the first time in the history of Russia, and really legitimate elections for the first and last time in the history of Russia. And they elected a new government. Now, the primary complaint, grievance, because happy people don't make revolutions, right? The primary complaint of the Russian people was that they wanted out of World War One. They were losing hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people for no apparent reason, as far as they could tell. They wanted their government to pull Russia out of the war. The Tsar refused to do that. And the protests became to the point where he was forced to basically give up power and resign. And this new government that was elected by the people, once they got into power, they also refused to do what the people were telling them to do, which was to get out of the war. All right. So in any republic, in any system where you vote for your leaders, one of the questions the leaders have to answer is, do I do what the voters want me to do, or do I do what I think is right, even if the voters disagree? And in this case, this new elected government basically told the people, we know you want us to get Russia out of this war, but you don't understand. We know things you don't know. That would not be a good idea. And they kept Russia in the war. So it's a great what if, right? If this new democratic government had pulled Russia out of the war, things would have gone very differently. So, but they didn't. So the second step was the communists are able to take advantage of this and overthrow that democratic government. The communists were able to say to the people, look, you voted, democracy is supposed to mean you get what you vote for, right? You voted in this new government. They're not listening to you. But we, the communists, we will listen to you. We promise we'll get you out of the war. And they were able to violently seize power and overthrow this brand new government. Uh, and the communists did end up pulling Russia out of the war. They gave the people what they wanted. Many liberals in the West supported this new Soviet government for ideological and political reasons. And a lot of them romanticized it to a degree that's important for you to understand. Um, there was an infamous quote from a college professor at the time describing Lenin, who was the leader of the communists, of the Bolshevik Party, leader of the communist revolution in Russia. And this very well-educated person in the West said Lenin was Christ-like, at least in his compassion. Wow, it's quite the compliment, no? Here are some quotes from Lenin. Hang the priests and the landowners. This is an order he's giving. And he's paying a bounty, 100,000 rubles for each man hanged. What about the priests? What about the clergy? Give them the most decisive and merciless battle so they will not forget it for decades to come. So he was Christ-like in his compassion, according to many elite progressives in the United States, and also, in his own words, this Christ-like figure, hang the priests. Now, this isn't a theology class, of course, but I've read the Bible cover to cover many, many times, and I regret to inform you there is no part in the Gospels where Jesus says, "Amen, I say unto you, hang the priests." So maybe this college professor was a little, you know, not critical enough in his assessment of Mr. Lenin. Maybe. Some other quotes from Lenin. Sometimes history needs a push. Great quote. He was a very smart guy. A really great quote. And it's true. It's true in your personal life. Sometimes you get into a rut. Sometimes you need to push. You need to make some changes, right? It's true. Sometimes history needs a push. 100%. Yes. Um, Sometimes history needs a jolt, a change, a revolution, to be sure. If history never got, quote, pushed, we would still have slavery, right? So sometimes history needs a push. The question is not, is that true? Because it is true sometimes. The question is, who's pushing and in what direction? Are we pushing history towards more peace, love, and happiness, or are we pushing history off a cliff? That's the question. Our program necessarily includes the propaganda of atheism. Communism is an atheistic ideology. He's not hiding the ball on this, be very clear about that. There are no morals in politics, there's only expedience. In other words, this is, if you're familiar with Machiavelli, the prince from the Renaissance, this is pure Machiavelli. The ends justify the means. There are no morals. There are no rules. There's only expedience. What's good for us to get and keep power? A scoundrel may be of use to us just because he is a scoundrel. Yeah, you need some scoundrels on your side because you need someone to, for example, hang the priests. Give us the child for 8 years, it will be a Bolshevik forever. This is a reference to the school system, the education system. If you control the education system, you control the future. He understood that very well. We talked briefly in an earlier unit about the United Daughters of the Confederacy and how they wanted to control what textbooks were used in schools in the South, if you remember that. It's the same idea. Good, bad, or indifferent, any group that can control the narrative in the education system has an incredible amount of control over society at large. It's an incredibly powerful thing to be able to control what young people are being taught. And speaking of controlling the education system, I want to present you with something that I'm fairly confident you have never been taught. This is a excerpt from a book. The book is called The Harvest of Sorrow, Soviet Collectivization and the Terror Famine. This is a book about a single event that happens in the Soviet Union that was perpetrated by the communists. It's not a book about the entire history of communism. It's not a book about the entire history of the Soviet Union. It's a book about one thing the communists did in that one country. This is the second sentence of the book. We may perhaps put this in perspective in the present case by saying that in the actions here recorded, about 20 human lives were lost for not every word, but every letter in this book. That sentence represents 3,040 lives. The book is 411 pages long. Okay. This author, Robert Conquest, wrote this book about this specific thing called the terror famine that the communists did. When he was finished writing the book, he's trying to figure out a way to explain to the reader just how many people were killed in this one event. And this is the metric he comes up with. When the book is completed, he counts it out. How many, not how many pages, not how many sentences, not how many words, how many letters are in the book? The book's 411 pages long. That's a lot of letters, right? He did the math. The communists killed so many people in this one event, the terror famine, that every letter in a 400 plus page book represents 20 dead people. That one sentence, therefore, in italics, represents more than 3,000 lives. Okay. I'm 100% confident that all of you were taught in high school about the Holocaust. When I say Holocaust, you're not thinking, what's that? It is good and necessary and appropriate that all of you were taught about the Holocaust. The event they're referring to here is called the Holodomor. And if we were in person and I asked you for a show of hands, I would expect that more than likely 0 of you would raise your hand if I asked you who was taught about the Holodomor. The shirt pictured here is the symbol of communism. I want to try to show you a couple things to illustrate what's going on in our education system in terms of what you are taught and what you are not taught. So I want to show you a few images here. If you go on Amazon, which is kind of a shorthand for what's available in our culture, okay? So you can buy that shirt I just showed you on the last slide with the symbol of the Soviet Union, and that symbol is responsible just in that one country for the murder of tens of millions of human beings, okay? Can you buy a Hitler shirt on Amazon? No, you can't. There is no shirt with Adolf Hitler's face on it. You can't buy a shirt showing him. Certainly can't buy a shirt separating him. They're not available in our broader culture. And, you know, that's probably good, right? Is anybody like, oh, come on, I want a Hitler shirt? No, because you were all rightfully educated that this man was a monster. There's no Hitler shirts. Why would there be? Right? The ideology that that man represented, Nazism, can you buy a shirt showing that? And you can't. You can't buy a shirt with a big swastika on it. Make Nazis afraid again. You understand what that's a play on, right? Make America great again. The only shirt you can buy with that symbol on it is that symbol crossed out, right? Good. We don't want that symbol. And if it's shown for any reason, it should be shown like this, crossed out. It's bad. It needs to be rejected. Good. Nazis are bad. Fact check true. Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious sexy Nazi POTUS. Okay. There's another one, same thing. So you cannot starve a Nazi, sell your Tesla. Oh, bless your heart. Okay. Um, you can't buy a shirt showing or referencing Adolf Hitler. You can't buy a shirt showing the swastika unless it's specifically crossed out, rejected. Okay. The only trends we see, if you scroll up and down, if you type in Nazi shirt, the only trends you see are Nazis are bad, correct, or shirts indirectly or just very in your face bluntly saying that President Trump is a Nazi. And or apparently now Elon Musk is also a Nazi because I don't know, reasons. Fine. Soviet shirt. You can't buy a shirt with a swastika because that symbol is responsible for the murder of tens of millions of people. So is this one. Can you buy a symbol with that shirt or a shirt with that symbol? Yeah, no problem. They're not crossed out. They're not saying communists are bad. You can just buy a shirt celebrating that symbol, or at the very least, not rejecting it. No problem. There's a bunch of them. Which one you want? KGB. That's their secret police responsible for the torture and murder of millions of people. No problem. Buy a KGB shirt if you're into that for some reason. You can buy communist shirts. You can buy shirts celebrating the Soviet Union. There's Lenin. You can buy a shirt with Lenin on it, striking this heroic pose. I wonder if on the back of the shirt it says, hang the priests. Are you detecting a bit of a double standard? Maybe just a little bit. In terms of the specific dictator, can't buy a Hitler shirt. Can you buy a Stalin shirt? He was the dictator after Lenin for the bulk of Soviet history. Yeah, you can buy a Stalin shirt. He murdered th 30 million people, but that was a long time ago, right? You can buy a Stalin shirt, different poses. Dark humor is like food, not everybody gets it. Gulag. A gulag is a slave labor camp. But if you think that kind of thing is funny, you can buy that shirt. Let's look at this one. Roses are red, violets are blue, homes are illegal, go to gulag. A gulag's a slave labor camp. Roses are red, violets are blue, poems are illegal, go to gulag. Is that funny? How about this? Roses are red, violets are blue, poems are illegal, go to gas chamber. Is that funny? That's not funny. Or maybe I'm just not sophisticated to understand that kind of humor. There's young Stalin, looking handsome. Broseph Stalin, ha ha ha. Dark humor is like food, not everybody gets it. Quit Stalin. Dark humor is like food, not everybody gets it. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny, right? I'm going to show you one more excerpt from that book. This is when the communists are intentionally starving to death millions of people in the Ukraine. The terror famine. I knew one woman with 4 children. She would tell them fairy stories and legends so that they would forget their hunger. Her own tongue could hardly move, but she would take them into her arms, even though she had hardly the strength to lift her arms when they were empty. Love lived on within her, and people noticed that where there was hate, people died off more swiftly, yet love for that matter saved no one. The whole village perished, one and all. No life remained in it. 11,860 lives. Dark humor is like food. Not everybody gets it. You know who didn't get food? Those 4 children. But F those kids, right? It's funny or something. There is a double standard in our education system where one genocidal death cult, the Nazis, you have all correctly, appropriately, necessarily been taught about their crimes and that everything about them needs to be rejected. Good. The problem is there's another genocidal death cult that killed way more people, way more people. And odds are, based on my experience, I've been doing this for a while, odds are very, very high that none of you were educated about what that symbol you see there is responsible for. The murder, not death. Death could be someone was in a car crash. Murder of 100 million human beings. But you can buy clothing on Amazon joking about it because our education system is dominated by teachers and textbook authors who will apologize for these people in this ideology because they think they had some good ideas. And apparently that's more important to some people than those 4 kids starving to death one by one in the arms of their mother intentionally. So, what's in the communist ideology? I'm just going to go through this really, really quickly. I don't want to read these one by one. You can look at this on your own time. I put it on the Canvas page. Uh, Essentially, the ideology is focused on no private property, Everything is owned collectively, which means owned by the government, and then the government decides who gets what. Okay. There are two things I want to point out to you, though. There's a 10 bullet points here of ideas that the communists tried to implement, and two of them actually we have adopted fully in this country. So even within this ideology, even people that reject communism, which you should, unless you're a fan of mass murder, even people that reject communism will recognize that, you know what, some of the ideas though are actually not evil. Some of them are actually reasonable and good, and we should implement them. So there's two that I want to focus on. Number two, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. I covered that in an earlier unit about how we got the income tax where we didn't have it before and how it's very progressive. The more you make, the higher percentage you pay. People in this country decided that was a good idea. That doesn't mean you're a communist. It means, they had some ideas that people embrace, even if they reject the overall ideology. So we adopted that element of the Communist Manifesto, heavy progressive income tax. And we also adopted, as we covered earlier in a prior unit, free education for all children in public school. And the flip side of that is abolishing child labor. All right. So there were certain ideas in the Communist Manifesto that you can adopt and implement without turning into a genocidal death cult. So, we got that going for us. On the home front in the United States, the war provided unprecedented opportunities for women, African Americans, and Mexican immigrants to enter the workforce because huge numbers of white men were in the military. So now those jobs were vacated, right? This leads to a big migration pattern that changes the demographics of the country. The Great Migration is what it's called. For all of American history, the enormous majority of African Americans lived in the Deep South. You know that. During this period, that changes for the first time, and significant numbers of African Americans leave the Deep South for the first time, and they go north and they go west and they go to the Midwest. And now all of a sudden, there are significant Black population centers in, you name it, New York, Chicago, LA, all over the country. Because during World War I, there were jobs available in these industrial cities, and a lot of African Americans, so these would be probably the grandchildren of emancipated slaves, for the first time left the Deep South, went to Detroit, went to Boston, all throughout the North and the Midwest and the West Coast looking for job opportunities. In the 1920, so this is another one of those progressive era constitutional amendments. The 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote in federal elections. They could already vote in many, many state elections. Most states run by Republicans allowed women to vote already, but this is a federal national thing, okay? The textbook author points out when they were talking about this, the Soviet Union acted first in 1917. In other words, women could vote in the Soviet Union before they could vote in the United States. Now, on paper, that's true. I would ask you to consider the point of view of the person that felt it necessary or useful to include that sentence. They felt very compelled to dunk on the United States, not by pointing out that it took us way too long to give women the vote in federal elections. That's true. We did take way too long. That's not the point they're making. The point they're making is the Soviet Union was ahead of us on this issue. The Soviet Union allowed women to vote before the United States. Doesn't that make the Soviet Union look great? What's the motive of the author here? What are they saying? Yes, women could vote in the Soviet Union before the United States. Yes, that makes us look bad. But for an educated person, which this author is, to casually say women could vote in the Soviet Union. Yeah, they could. They could vote in one-party uncontested elections in a genocidal death cult. They could vote for Lenin or Lenin. Soviet Union acted first. Good Lord. At the end of the war, the map changed. The Some of the empires were broken up. The side that lost got punished accordingly. That empire right in the middle of Europe that we referred to earlier, where the assassination happened that started this whole sequence of events, was broken up into smaller pieces. So that's nationalism kind of at work. Germany lost territory, and that, in retrospect, kind of sets the stage for World War II. The Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, we haven't talked about them yet, but that was a major empire in the Middle East. They were on the losing side, so they got broken up as well, and new countries were created out of the old Ottoman Empire. Places like Syria, Palestine, Iraq, not places you're going to go for spring break. Some of the most chaotic, dangerous, violent places on earth. And for the purposes of this course, we don't need to get too deep into the weeds on why these countries and borders were drawn the way they were. But this is a reminder that if you look at the chaos going on in the Middle East, a lot of it, not all of it, I mean, how far back you want to go? You want to go back to Moses? It's always been chaotic. But the chaos happening there now, a lot of it can be traced back to the way World War One ended and the way the map of the Middle East was carved up by the British Empire specifically. The Treaty of Versailles, this is the treaty that ends the war. Some stipulations, some main facts of the treaty. Germany had to accept that they alone were guilty for this whole thing, were responsible for this whole thing. Nobody else was responsible or guilty for this war happening. Maybe you agree with that. I don't know. And so that leads to the second point, reparations. We've talked about reparations before in the context of American slavery. Germany was made to pay reparations for, according to the winners, being 100% responsible for all the damage done. Therefore, they need to pay reparations. They lost territory to surrounding countries. In this map, those areas are in yellow and orange, and in retrospect, that leads to Hitler's rise to power. The League of Nations is established. That's kind of, if you're familiar with the United Nations now, it's a similar idea, but the United States did not join the League of Nations out of reluctance to be part of international institutions where we're not in charge and we might need to follow other countries' policies or decisions. We didn't want to be involved with that. Now, though, we are, as you know, now we're in the United Nations. So we'll get back to how the end of World War One, from a certain point of view, kind of sets up the beginning of World War II when we get to that unit. The last couple things here, a couple interesting parallels with our timeline. Number one, a pandemic. 1918, the flu pandemic killed 20 million people, a little bit more than the entire World War that had just ended. And that's a reminder, history is often not driven by human behavior, but by things out of our control, by climate, by a disease. A lot of interesting parallels with COVID. It was almost precisely 100 years before COVID. The flu. When we talk about the flu now, are you going to get your flu shot, whatever? That's this. It's still with us. It's endemic. It's never going to go away, just like COVID. COVID will always be with us. It mutates every year, um, but it never disappears. The end of the war helped this disease, helped the flu spread more rapidly because as the war ended, you have millions of soldiers going home, crossing borders, crossing oceans, all kinds of people moving back and forth all across the globe, and that's going to help the virus spread more quickly, of course. And the last event covered in this chapter that you might see some parallels with recent events, the President of the United States was mentally and physically incapable of doing the job, and the Democrat Party and the media and his wife all joined forces to keep that as best as they could from the public. Woodrow Wilson had a series of strokes. He was totally incapacitated, mentally and physically. Um, and his party, the Democrats and the media and his wife, colluded to, as best they could, cover up the reality of the president's condition from the American people. And so essentially, in retrospect, his wife was basically the president. She decided who had access to the president. She decided what got signed, what didn't. Uh, she was, by most accounts, essentially running the country. And President Wilson was insisting on running for re-election, at which point his party finally came to him and said, "This is not happening. If you don't give it up, we will expose you and tell everybody about your actual condition." And at that point, he was persuaded to not seek another term. I don't know if you think there are any parallels between that history and what we saw in 2024. I'll leave that up to you to assess, but uh, some interesting similarities, at least on paper, I think. All right, so that wraps up that unit, and I'll see you next time.